Welcome, everyone, to the webinar uh, on the National Academy of Education Spencer Dissertation Fellowship application. My name is Jack Busby. I am the Senior Director at the National Academy of Education, overseeing professional development and membership. With me today is my colleague, Taylor Johnson, Program Officer, and Dr. Mikhail Karlander, previous Chair of the Dissertation Selection Committee, Professor of Education Policy, and Chair at the School of Education at the University of California, Davis. Welcome all, and thank you for being here with me today. So for today's webinar presentation, I want to do a quick review of the different things that we're going to be talking about. We'll kick off with some technical remarks, just in case you have any problems during this webinar, actions you can take. We'll review the fellowship. We'll also provide some insight on the online application portal. Some tips when it comes to writing for your audience, the panelists, the different reviewers, and then we'll also leave a good amount of time to answer your questions. We expect about 30 minutes or so to be able to answer any of the questions you may have. And if we do not get to your questions, please do write to us at info@naeducation.org. So if you do have any technical issues, for example, if you cannot hear us right now, please do write to us via the Q&A box, which should be in the lower right-hand side of your screen. We will respond to questions at the end of the webinar, but you may type your questions in the Q&A box at any point during this presentation. We are also recording this webinar, and we will post the recording on our website and also on YouTube to make sure that you all have an opportunity to go back and listen to this again in case you have, need your questions answered. All right, fellowship information. While this webinar is primarily about the application process, I do want to briefly describe the benefits of this fellowship. This fellowship is funded by the Spencer Foundation and administered by the National Academy of Education. It is intended to be a capstone to your dissertation writing experience for support and mentorship. If you are selected, you will receive a non-renewable $27,500 stipend for 1 year, and you will attend 2 mandatory retreats, one in the fall and one in the spring. The fall retreat is held simultaneously with our members' annual meeting. These retreats are a keystone of your fellowship experience, where you will receive mentorship from a mentor or former fellow, or from a member or former fellow, network with your cohort and our membership, and receive professional development. During the spring retreat, you will present the results of your research as part of our Fellows Forums panels. You also have the option to participate in a poster presentation at ARA in 2025. Regarding administration of the fellowship, you may directly administer your funds or request your university to administer them. We support either option and recommend you make the decision in partnership with your department. Regarding eligibility, you should be all but dissertation by the time the fellowship period begins on June 1st, 2024. You do not have to be a U.S. citizen, but you must be enrolled in a doctoral program at a U.S. institution of higher education. The award supports the fellowship recipient with the final analysis and writing of the dissertation. You must complete your data collection and initial analysis before June 1st of 2024. If you cannot meet this deadline, then clearly articulate in your application how and when you will collect your data and how this will not impede finalizing your dissertation by the end of the grant period. The timeline you present in your application is an important indicator in the selection process, with the committee paying careful attention to pre- and post-award milestones. In your timeline, present a reasonable plan for how you will complete coursework, data collection, initial analysis, comprehensive exams, and a defense of your proposal. Your post-award tasks should include, but are not limited to, writing milestones and your final dissertation defense. While the end of the fellowship does not necessarily need to align with your dissertation defense, they should not be outrageously different. You must hold the fellowship for a minimum of 9 months, so you should have sufficient work left to fill this timeline. If your defense will be a year or more away from the proposed end of your fellowship, you should ensure you have a reasonable timeline for finishing pre-award tasks. If you have sufficient time left before graduation, then you can submit next year. Once the application portal closes on October 5th, NAEd staff will review applications for completeness and appropriateness. Staff will then assign your application to 2 external reviewers who are not a part of our selection committee. We do this to try very much to closely align your research to the expertise of these reviewers, but perfect matches are often not possible. Reviews are then sent to our selection committee. Several members of the committee will read your application and present an overview of the review and of the external reviewers during a meeting held in February of 2024. In March, we will notify you if you are moving to the semifinalist stage. If a semifinalist, we will ask you to submit an update to our committee regarding your proposal, timeline, and budget. We then hold a second selection committee meeting in April, where we will select 35 finalists. We will then update you on your status in May. The fellowship begins July of 2024. Taylor, pass it over to you.
Sure. So the application portal. So if you experience any difficulties with the online application or something doesn't look right with the portal, please contact the NAEd staff for assistance. It's very important that you make sure that you're applying to the correct fellowship. After creating your login, you will be redirected to a page to choose a fellowship. Make sure that you select the Dissertation Fellowship. If you are a previous applicant, you need to start a new application. Our staff will not review an application submitted to last year's application. The application deadline for this year is October 5th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. You and your references must meet this deadline. This is a hard time and date, and we will not accept submissions, additions, or edits after the deadline. Staff will also not make changes on your behalf. You must complete all required fields to submit your application. You must submit all documentation in PDF and make sure that that PDF is not locked. This not only minimizes errors and difficulties for us to down the line to, this not only minimizes efforts and difficulties for us down the line, but also streamlines your application for reviewers. For instance, sometimes transcripts are uploaded that can only be opened by the student or institution, or access privileges will lock you out after a certain amount of time. So please check to make sure that none of these securities are in place before you upload your PDF documentation. It is also very important that you talk to your reference writers well in advance of preparing for your application. You want to give them plenty of time to write a strong letter of recommendation, as the selection committee reviews these submissions very critically. Remember, they have the same deadline as you do, which is October 5th, 2023 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. The application portal will send an automated email when you input the names of your references with the instructions and a link to upload their letters. Applicants will receive a notification and confirmation email when a reference submits their letter. Throughout the selection process, we will provide written updates by email. It is very important that you submit all emails correctly. Finally, to close the overview of the application, we have 2 tips of advice. Number 1, all application components, including the letter of recommendation, are due October 5th, 2025 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. However, we suggest submitting your application well ahead of time. Additionally, since we are a small staff, we typically have difficulties keeping up with all applicants and recommendation writers who try to contact us the day the application is due. Please plan accordingly and have questions addressed before the deadline occurs. When the application overview is completed, we will turn the presentation. With the application overview completed, I will turn the presentation to Dr. Kurlander, who will talk more about the narrative and your audience.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome everybody, and thanks for being with us today to talk about this, and hopefully we can answer some of your questions about the narrative and further in the Q&A. So I'm going to start with who you're writing for, who is your audience. So again, to remind you, this is education is a multidisciplinary venture, and so you're writing for academics doing work on education and education-related research across diverse fields. And so there are multiple disciplines are represented on the selection committee. And so you're really reading for a kind of an intelligent general audience, right? It is important to know that the first review will be done with people closer to your discipline as best we can. So we don't always have a perfect match, but it is likely people closer to your specific disciplinary and methodological tradition in the first review. And then the broader selection committee in the following review periods are across a variety of disciplines, from teaching and learning, from history, economics, sociology, psychology. People working in schools of education and in related fields, not necessarily in departments or schools of education. So it's really important to know that in doing so, you're going to, and I'll say more about this, you're going to try to avoid very jargony language that's specific to your discipline. So again, it's important to know that the committee has broad expertise across methodological traditions and analytic approaches, and therefore can read a variety of different types of projects. You're going to try to make sure that this could be understood. So a good peer in your program that's maybe not directly in your specific type of research, either methodologically or disciplinarized, is a good external reader for you to think about using as you prepare your narrative. We can go ahead and advance the slide. All right, so what does your audience need to know? I'm going to say more on the next slide about each of these. First, they need to know why your work is important to the field, right? What's its importance to the field of education? They need to know that the project is high quality and feasible, and we'll say more about that. It's also why we're very specific with when you should apply for the program, for the fellowship, at the dissertating writing stage, not at the data collection or the planning phase. And they need to know about you. This is a program that invests not just in giving you money towards completion, but it's a fellowship that relies heavily on mentoring and building a stronger network for you professionally. And so we want to know more about you, your background, and what you'd like to do in the future. So we're also investing in you as a scholar in this program. How are you going to convey all this? You're going to convey it through your application, through your letters of recommendation, through your supplemental questions on your career goals and your personal statement. They all play a role in communicating these three components. So let me say more about each of those in the next slide. All right, so the importance of the research. We really want to know, again, what's at stake. This is one of my favorite committees to serve on, partly because I get to learn new things coming out of the field, right? So we really look to emerging scholars to tell us what's critical and what's coming up. And so this is, again, a signature program for the National Academy and for Spencer Foundation to build up the field in new and exciting ways. So we want to know what's at stake. Why is this important? How will our understanding of a phenomena be different as a result of your research? And so here is where I would say, be bold in telling us those, right? So include sentences and that say what will we learn from this project, why it's important, why it extends the fields in key ways. So make sure we don't have to get that just from the letters of recommendation or just from a committee member who knows the field, who then tells the rest of the committee why this is exciting. You be the person to tell us why it's exciting, why it's important to the field, what's new here, right? And specifically, would you expect, when possible, we care about applied work. So we also care about why it's important for the future of education, for schooling, for children, for improving outcomes. And so when the work is heavily applied, we also look for you to tell us why it's important to the field beyond just the field of research, but the field of applied education. We also care a lot about the quality of the research. So this is heavily discussed. And so you want to make sure that a very big chunk of your narrative is devoted to the methodology. I'm not going to give a precise ratio, but you want to make sure that in the 8 to 10 pages, depending on font and that you use to do the fellowship, that you spend a significant amount on the design and methodology of your study. And so what is the overall approach and why is it appropriate to answering your research question, right? So you want to make sure that the work, and I'll say more about appendices and how you can do that on such a short, in such a short proposal. But we do care a lot about the design of your study and that it's feasible, right? So you want to provide specifics on data collection, on the analysis plan, and how the analysis plan shows that you're able to answer the research questions that you posed. If there are important limitations and that are important for us to consider, you should include those as well. And don't let a reviewer or someone else raise them. So if you know that there are some limitations to your study, it's better to be upfront about them. We saw a lot of this with the pandemic era research, and there are any number of reasons why there may be limitations in design that are important for you to raise. And then it shows us that you are aware of those limitations. Just go back for 1 second. Thank you. Whoops. Where are we? Forward. I think we're going backwards. Couple more. Next one. There we go. All right. And then the quality of the application here, it's less in the narrative. We'll know about the soundness of the research from the actual project narrative, but we also we assess if the applicant shows promise for a career in research. Again, this program in particular is meant to on investing in kind of education researchers. And so it's not to say that if you want to go back into the classroom, whether it's not important, but the program is primarily looking for folks who are planning to build a career in education research. So we want to know how your prior experiences and your future work. You can definitely leave some space in the personal statement, or sometimes people even can do this in a concluding paragraph in the narrative about where their work is headed as they look kind of beyond the dissertation. And again, keep in mind, this is your dissertation work. I did one not that many years ago. It's not your greatest contribution. It's just one of many contributions you have. And so we do look at this as kind of piece of a larger whole of the scholar and their broader contributions to the field. So we look at other things that you provide in your application. All right, so I know that probably raised more questions, and so we'll keep going, and then I know many of you, they're coming through in the Q&A. All right, so just a couple recommendations, and then a lot of these we'll answer through Q&A. Consider your timeline carefully. This comes up a lot. It already came up with some questions, and so when's a good time to apply to this? So a good time to apply is after you've completed your data collection. Maybe you're working on data collection right now. And in anticipation of getting a fellowship, this one or others next year would be working on writing off of that data. So that's a really good time when the project is beyond the development stage and kind of either deep in the collection or really in the analysis phase for qualitative researchers. Quantitative researchers who are relying on administrative data or other secondary data sources or an experiment that's been done in the field, that's a good time, right? When you've already collected that data, worked with it, cleaned it, and are ready to do the analysis and the writing. I'm going to say a word about multi-paper dissertations, primarily a tradition in economics, but increasingly we see it in education policy at large. And so we do always fund several people who come from fields where there is a multi-paper dissertation study, a dissertation package. And so typically what I would say is, I think the wording on the side here is that the committee struggles with this. We struggle when people try to talk about all three papers. And so again, like I said, we definitely award folks who are coming from fields with a 3-paper tradition. But my big recommendation here is to focus on one, on your job market paper, as often in economics, but on the primary paper, regardless of the discipline you're in. It's not to say you can't mention the others, and definitely if they're part of a larger whole and on a similar topic that may lend itself to describing more than just the main one, but to really do a good job, as I mentioned on the prior slide, with the design, with the limitations of the design, with the theoretical framework, with the prior literature. It's very hard to do that on 3 totally different topics and research questions. So we strongly recommend that you focus on one. And if you want to tell us what the others are about, that is a great way to kind of talk about how it's part of a larger project or a set of papers. Again, this is a competitive grant, very few, many more deserving students than we can give it to. And one easy way to turn down an application is when it's sloppy. So just want to remind you to check your writing, to get request feedback, to just to make sure you proof it, and that your references that you cite are there, and all of those kinds of things. And so please try and prep the application early enough that you could have someone help you proofread it and again, look it over before you submit. Try and pay attention to the acronyms you use that may seem like part of your regular vocabulary now, but may not be, depending to the reader who's not in your specific discipline. So you want to think about using acronyms and jargon, with caution and carefully, and to make sure it's able to be read. And that's why I strongly recommend a peer who's a little bit outside of your area to read over your application. A big piece of the application is those letters of recommendation. And here, the best thing you could do is prepare your letter writers about this, what they should include in your letter. And the best way you can do that is to provide them, even if it's a draft. I write letters every year as well. Even if it's a draft, a plan, your narrative, a draft of your narrative well in advance, so that they can write a more specific, a more detailed letter for us. And that's because if it's a generic letter, we might sort of say, oh, we think Taylor's great. It's obvious that this recommender thinks Taylor's great, but we don't know what about her project is so great and how it would extend the field. And when you give that narrative early and you have that discussion with your letter writer, you can they can write letters that tell us not only is Taylor great, but here's why her project is really, could change the field in important ways, could open new frontiers, or et cetera. And so those letters that tell us also why the work is really important to the field are really useful. All right. Let's see. Appendix. This comes up. You have space in an appendix. You do not want to use that as space for extending your narrative, right? So it's important to know we choose very judicious reviewers who are going to look at everything, but they don't look at the appendix with as close an eye as they do the rest of the narrative. And some really just skim it. So you absolutely do not want to use the appendix as an extended page count by any means. And we actually, as you note on the slide, are not required, right? The selection committee and it's not technically required. Doesn't mean they don't look at it, but you should assume that they may not, right? So you want to be judicious when including an appendix and how much to include. The narrative should include all the critical information, and the appendix should really just be an opportunity to elaborate. What's some examples of where it might elaborate? You may have done some due diligence on a data set or on a method that you want to show has proof of concept, and you might want to just, again, no one has to look at it, but it's there if you want to see the kind of the model I'm fitting, or how it looks with pilot data, or a protocol for a qualitative study that just shows that how you're thinking about implementing a particular data strategy. Then that's a good thing to include in an appendix. Some people include detailed models, empirical models in an appendix because they feel like they don't have space in the main narrative to include it. And so they might have a few sentences that describe the general model they plan to fit, and then an appendix that includes it. So again, use it judiciously. Don't assume folks will look at it. But again, for many projects, it is helpful to have those additional few pages for an appendix. Not required, but helpful. All right. I think you have lots of questions. I'll try to take on the ones about the narrative as they come and answer them live. And I think everyone can see the questions. And so on the ones on timing, I know, and we had several on timing and on folks in EDD programs. There's no requirement on PhD or ED. We're really just looking for people once they're at the, that are doing research and plan a careers in research. So I don't know if that answers the questions for the EDD folks. You are eligible. Yeah, so this is one of those questions I think I answered live. Yeah, you're absolutely eligible as an EDD student. And
you're right, Mikhail. We do have a lot of timing questions here. So I think just as a blanket statement, what we're looking for is to make sure that all pre-dissertation requirements are completed by June 1st of 2024. If one of the things that we are asking for in the application is for a timeline, and within that timeline is where you're going to be able to note down when you're going to be able to meet the different components if you haven't met it by October 5th. And that timeline is going to be very important because then that gives the review committee a very strong understanding of where you are at in your research, and then if you're going to be able to complete the research in time during the period of the fellowship. So do make sure to provide a lot of important content within that timeline, in that time frame or question that we have.
I keep going on some of these others, Jack.
Yeah. So we were asked about a question here about references, like what do they receive? So when you submit the names of the different reference letter writers, you're going to be putting in their email. That will then send an automatic request to them via the application portal on the different components that we're asking for them to complete and what it is that we're asking them to write towards. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be efforts on your part, as Dr. Carolander was sharing, of preparing them and getting them, setting them up for success so that they can help you out in the material that you're submitting, but for them to also have a better understanding of you and also the research that you're going to be submitting for the award. So they will receive different requests within the letter that we send them of what to submit to the application.
There's a question about data collection and the funding. I mean, so in general, it's hard with specifics. So in general, no, your data collection should be done. But there, again, I don't know your specific case. And so there may be, if there's after the fact a need for follow-ups or something in a way that equipment could be used as part of a budget, that's possible. But as a general rule of thumb, the work would be, the data would already be either in your possession because you're using secondary data or because you've already collected. That's the ideal time. Again, there are occasionally unique circumstances, but that's the general rule of thumb.
We have a question here about the award period. So we begin in June, July of 2024. The shortest period that you can have the award is 9 months, and then the longest is 2 years. The majority of folks will be completing their fellowship during the next academic year, so the 2024 into 2025 academic year. But you have as little as 9 months to complete or as long as 24 months, and that's something that we will work with you to try to figure out the best approach to take.
So I have a question about how, for folks who are not directly in education, how to make the strong case for education. We do love education-related fields across the humanities and social sciences, and sometimes even in the hard sciences. And again, the best thing you could do is tell us why it's important for education, right? You want to write for, again, a more general audience that's a little bit outside of your narrow discipline, although with enough specificity that someone who knows your discipline well will understand, the rigor of the approach. But the best thing you could do is tell us why it's so relevant to the field of education at large, which again is a multidisciplinary field. So I think showing some connections, if folks, one common mistake people make is assume that folks, education researchers maybe don't study a particular phenomena or space. And so if you're in a field, you want to make sure you've done your due diligence and look at the kind of education research at large, not every journal and not all your time, but just to show that you have knowledge about why your work is particularly important to the field and why its connections to education are useful, whether they're directly applied, like in a very applied sense, or more broadly, theoretically or conceptually. So hopefully that helps.
We have a question here about if an applicant is not selected, do we provide reasons as to why? Unfortunately, just because of capacity and the great amount of applications that we do receive, we're not able to provide feedback to applicants on why they do or do not move forward. But do note that there are fellows who may not have passed the first time, but then they pass the second time in applying. So we do recommend that you, if you still meet within the eligibility criteria, to go ahead and reapply.
Keep going. So I got another one. Is that okay? It's okay.
Yeah.
So let me do these two. One is on supporting thematic work or essays or kind of more thought pieces. We, again, I think are open to any disciplinary tradition, to any kind of, it is typically more, we do find typically more empirical types of projects, but I wouldn't rule yourself out. Again, we have in the past done this for quite a few years, done more philosophy of education or more conceptual pieces, not just those that are empirical nature, empirical broadly used, qualitative, quantitative, historical methods. So if it's truly like essays or kind of, I think you'd want to make sure that, again, you're thinking about what's the what's new here, and obviously the conceptual framing and why it expands kind of our understanding of, again, in this case, you're talking about educational expansion. So I know it's too general of a space to kind of get into it, but I think you just want to think about how you're pitching it to us, and again, is this part of a larger study, a larger set of papers. So I wouldn't rule out a conceptual piece that's not empirical by any means. So I can't say we don't support. We definitely do support, and we definitely have funded projects like that in the past. But I do think because most of the work we fund is empirical nature, you do have a little bit more work to sort of pitch the project to us. The other one I just wanted to answer live is the question around personal statement versus the 250-word prompt on positionality. So the personal statement, we really look to you to tell us what brought you to this point where you see yourself headed. What are the things you're thinking about, whether from your prior personal or professional experiences that have led you to do this work and that you see will carry you as an emerging scholar down the road. So that's the kind of personal statement. The word on positionality is really around your own identity and how it impacts the work. So sort of your own positionality as, I'm a white female with a particular set of experiences in that sense, or my positionality if I'm studying a particular group, my connection to that group or my non-connection to the group. So it's really a positionality vis-a-vis kind of your own identity, the things that make up your identity that you think are relevant to include, and how it might impact the project that you're taking on, population you're studying, the setting you're in, that type of thing. Hopefully that answers that question.
I just had it. Where did it go? There was a question here about how does the funding support the fellow, especially when it comes to like working part-time or working full-time. So the expectation here really is for the funding to be able to assist you in limiting really the amount of work that you take on, so that you can focus on the writing of your dissertation. Now, we know that sometimes fellows will still need to do some work of like 5 or 10 hours of part-time work for their institution or just be able to support themselves. That's quite all right. We just ask you to notify us. But the intent here is not for you to have a full-time job and be a fellow, as well as we are trying to buy out your time essentially to focus on the writing. The funding that we provide you also will not be covering flights and lodging to our fellowships. We will cover that as well. So really, like the funding that we provide you, the $27,500, is to support your livelihood, and a lot of people will use that for like groceries or rent or daycare or what have you, in order to support them towards their writing.
Okay, sorry, I'm trying to answer some on all right, let's see. A lot on the appendix. The historians to use primary sources. You could include a list. I wouldn't include necessarily the actual primary. I wouldn't have a very long appendix, but maybe a list of the primary sources that you plan or already have obtained. I think that's a good way to approach that. Again, I think I mentioned on the personal statement. Just again, here we really want to learn about you, what motivates you to do this work. Perhaps it has been a particular experience you had. Again, it doesn't have to be from your own kind of childhood or background. It could be from your professional experiences, prior work that you did with a particular population, or a prior study that you did that led you to this larger, the next phase of your work. I think you could focus in that way. There was a question around methods. We really do our best as much as we can to award across disciplinary and methodological traditions, and we really make an effort to make sure that there are lots of both, all types of, even qualitative, quantitative is even too generic of a term, but broadly speaking. So don't ever rule yourself out and say, oh, I'm ethnographer, I shouldn't apply, they're only going to fund quantitative. Not true. We always fund lots of great ethnographies, and don't be an economist or a sociologist say, oh, my work is too heavily quantitative for this, because we also fund lots. If you look at who's been funded, we always fund students from economics and sociology and others who do heavily quantitative work. I think there was a question about your career trajectory to academia. We don't assume you're going to get a job in academia for any number of reasons, but we do look for folks who want to do, it's a research-focused fellowship. So research firms or other types of think tanks is perfectly fine. You don't have to know where exactly your career is headed in that sense. Consider when choosing recommendation letter writers. I think you want to make sure at least one of the two, at least one, can really speak to the project, why the project is important. If you can't get two to do that for any number of reasons, timing, closeness to folks, that's okay, but at least one really speaks to why the project is really important. The other one, maybe you TA'd for, or you were an RA for them, and they can speak to your larger kind of intellect, your kind of work ethic, your career trajectory. That's great. But I would just, and ideally they can do all that and speak to your project, but I would just recommend that at least one is really closely familiar with your work and why it's important.
We have a point of clarification here. Do you need to be a U.S. citizen? You do not have to be a U.S. citizen in order to apply for this fellowship, but you must be a candidate for a doctoral degree at a graduate institution within the U.S.
Letter writers can come, that don't have to be from your institution, but if they're not from your institution, they should indicate how they know you. Maybe from your prior master's program, or you're working on a multi-campus research project or something like that.
So about location here again, you must be a candidate at a graduate institution within the U.S., but that does not mean that your research can't be from outside the U.S. We've funded many fellows in the past who have done who are completing research that's outside the U.S. That's quite all right. We just the requirement is that you must be attending a graduate institution in the U.S. When it comes to the application portal, you're welcome to, it's not like as soon as you enter it, you must complete all the information. You can go in and out over the course of the open period that we have right now, but you just must have everything submitted by October 5th. With the application itself, you can also submit it before your reference writers have submitted it. You're not required to wait until they do. So if you do finish your application, you're more than welcome to hit submit, and then it will still remain open for your reference writers to submit their part. But as a reminder, they do have the same deadline as you do. So for your application to be complete, they must submit their references by October 5th.
So we have some questions about just what have we seen as some potential weaknesses in design? I mean, I think the main thing I can say is on the methods, because I think the question was like, what are strong or have been some common weaknesses in design. So the most common is when you use really generic language. It's really short, a paragraph or two that's like, I could pull out of a textbook on data analysis with qualitative interviews. It's generic to any project. It's just kind of methods speak for the sake of speak in a couple paragraphs, and doesn't tie specifically to your data, your questions, or I will fit multiple regression, whatever it is that could be about any topic. And so you just want to make sure you really flesh out your research design section, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, that shows that utilizes your questions, your data to really tell us how you plan to do the work. You could absolutely say, you could use paragraphs like, for example, my code book includes X, Y, and Z, or I think if you're doing a quantitative study, you don't have space to put all of the models or any models. I think, again, sometimes it's helpful to put a generic model and say more specific models are in the appendix, or to put the specific and if you have space, and then you just really want to show how this, how that, the model you put out is going to explain, is going to help answer the research question and what we'll learn from it. I think especially for quantitative scholars, because we have the kind of the range of disciplines, things like selection bias or identification strategy are it looks a little bit differently if you're coming from different fields of study. And so you just want to be attentive to that you're using words like impact or effective, like appropriately for across disciplines. And so I think if you're reading broadly, again, if you're a quantitative scholar, for example, in economics or sociology, you might want to look at the top quantitative oriented education journals, just to sort of see, sort of just to look at language a little bit to know that you're, folks, what a general audience could look like in education policy at large. Similarly, for qualitative studies, I think you should assume that the selection committee will be well represented with a variety of disciplinary traditions within the broader qualitative data approach.
Some questions here regarding the duration period for the fellowship. The minimum duration is 9 months. The maximum is 24 months. If you believe that you're going to be completed with your dissertation with less time, then you're probably too far along in your dissertation writing right now to apply for this dissertation. And if that's the case, then we do recommend that you begin looking. It's too early for you to apply, but begin looking at the postdoctoral fellowship. And then you might be able to apply in a few years to that one, but you'll have an idea of, what we're looking for that postdoctoral fellowship. But the minimum award is 9 months for the dissertation fellowship.
I see. Yeah, definitely want to encourage. I have a question here about reapplying. Just really want to encourage you to, if you're still in a position, if you maybe applied too early, or just for whatever reason, or too early in that you're not completing and you still have eligibility, to reapply on any given year. Folks, we do see some applications that we remember from the prior year. And I don't have any particular, I can give you some common pitfalls as I already have, but I will also say we also just have way more eligible, excellent candidates and proposals than we can, award. And so, again, as I say to my own doctoral students, they just, you can't get it if you don't apply, so you have to apply, but you also just need to know that there's many number of things we're balancing. As you might imagine, we're really trying to build a cohort that's really diverse. And so we just can't fund 30, amazing ethnographies or 30 amazing historical pieces or 30, folks from sociology, but we have more than that come every year that come through. So, you never know why you didn't make it to the final, to the end. And so I definitely would encourage you to reapply.
We have a couple of questions here about the retreats. These are mandatory. The expectation is that fellows will be attending, and also they're just fantastic opportunities to be able to meet the cohort, to be able to meet National Academy of Education members, because there's just a wealth of information and knowledge and expertise. And it's always fantastic. You just walk down the hallway and there's your bibliography. It's a fantastic opportunity to be able to meet and learn from them. And because of that, we do highly try to support fellows attending the actual retreats, as opposed to trying to do so remotely. Now, of course, during COVID, we had remote retreats, but now that hopefully things are progressing positively, we're trying to get everyone to come and meet in person. Traditionally, we meet in DC. Now, if for whatever reason accommodations are needed for virtual access to the retreats, we can work with you, but our goal is to, again, we will fund you to come to the retreats and we will house you as well. So our expectation is to try to get you to visit the retreats in person. Trying to go through here. Taylor, are there any that we might have missed from up top as all these new questions keep popping in?
Yeah, I'm trying to answer.
Yeah, I've been writing in the chat answering some of them, but someone had a particular question about whether or not they'll be notified when their letter of recommendation has been submitted. Our portal allows you to view if the recommendation letter has been submitted, and if you log back in and you see that it hasn't, you can also send them reminders like, hey, don't forget this letter of recommendation is also due the same time as your application. I'm trying to think if there are other ones. I think it might be beneficial for us to review or to elaborate specifically on timelines. And so people are asking questions regarding, like, if your institution has a different classification for you, like you have to finish your dissertation proposal before this time frame, are they still eligible based off of like whatever month they get that approved? Can we go further in depth as to what our timeline would look like when you're filling out that application? I'm trying to find the exact question.
While you look for that, I'll just answer for those who have
Sure.
various NSF funding. You're still eligible to apply, and then if there are consequences related to being funded by both, you would assess that after the fact. But I would not apply to the fellowship. So if you currently have one of the NSF graduate awards, you can still apply. We love domestic and non-US projects. Please apply, whether you're a scholar from another country, but also if you're doing work in another international context, please apply. We always fund a lot of international projects. I think we have roughly 300 applications typically, right, Jack? Is that
Something like that, yeah. A question about, like, do you need to start in June or July? If you, depending, that is when the period begins, but we will work with you on your timeline. The earliest you can start is June or July of 2024. I believe the latest you can start would be January of 2025 for the fellowship. So sometime in between that window is your start date. And again, the minimum is 9 months for the fellowship period. We cannot provide, or we do not provide examples of like eligible timelines or examples of fellowships that, or of the actual like applications of fellowships that have been awarded in the past. But we do recommend that if you're looking for, what has been funded in the past, that you go to our website. At the very bottom of the NAEd Spencer Dissertation Fellowship Program page, you'll see past recipients listed there by cohort, and you can go through there and you can review all the different projects that we funded in the past.
Right. We have like 80 some questions still in there. So if we're not getting to it, feel free to just repeat it in some ways, because I'm not sure I can scroll fast enough.
And I know we've answered quite a few of these already, which is why we're trying to read through and make sure we do address all your questions. If we haven't yet, then please do put it back in there. If you have a very specific question, we do welcome you to write to us at info@naeducation.org. The email is there on the screen as well. And you can be as specific and detailed as you want through that medium, and we will respond to you hopefully within the next couple business days.
I got a few on the 3 papers. I know it's tough because you feel like, what, that's just 1/3 and I want to explain it all. I think, again, what I would just convey, because without knowing your specific projects for any of you, is that the challenge with this describing all 3 that we saw is that you didn't do justice to the framing, the theory, the methods, when you only had 2 to 3 pages for each. And so if you can do justice by explaining more than just that one paper, for example, for many of you might be using the same data source, and so you might be able to spend more time speaking about the other projects, then that's fine. Just make sure that for at least one of the projects, you're able to really get into the details of the design, because without it, it's really hard. We sort of say, oh, it's too bad they only gave us 3 pages on this. Again, you might be wanting to hedge your bets and say, well, some committee members might be interested in this paper 2 more than paper 1, so I really want to talk about it. So that's why often I recommend spending a couple paragraphs reminding us this is part of a larger set of papers on the economics of education, and they cover these other areas. And so what happens then for the committee is we say, obviously, this is just one of their 3 papers, and look, the other one is this. We don't have as much information, but we can sort of still talk about the excitement we have for that other work. But the soundness of that scholar's ability to execute the work is still found on our close review of that first paper. So hopefully that makes sense to folks on why those 3 papers are tricky. But we do always fund projects with 3 papers. So I do encourage you to still submit. You just want to be cautious with how you're devoting your page, your words to those 3 projects. I think there's a question about the project work plan. I don't think we've answered that one. Is that right? There's no word limit. Yeah, I think you just want to be specific to your field, right? So if you're in a field where you're like describing piloting and then being in the field, collecting data and then cleaning it, whatever, you want to be as specific about that work plan. Some people are using existing administrative data sets, and so they might talk about like generally obtaining those MOUs to work with the data, cleaning the data, and then doing analysis. So that's very specific to your kind of your field of study, your discipline. Some questions on the positionality depending on your field. Again, we just, again, it's just another opportunity for you to be able to sort of talk about your own background and why in some cases, and maybe it's not, but it's in some ways we believe people are interested in the topics that they're working on for a variety of reasons. And so it's an opportunity for you to connect to the work, connect your own kind of background and identity to that work. So there isn't any specific guidelines on it other than to be reflective around why you're studying the topics that you're studying and how your own kind of prior history or background might play a role in that. It also play a role in why why the topic is important or any number of other ways. And so it really is meant to be truly open-ended.
Oh, we've just gotten a few questions about like what type of research is funded. Again, the research that the Dissertation Fellowship funds is broadly conceived when it comes to research in the field of education. So if you are completing research in the field of education, then please do apply to the fellowship. There isn't one type of methodology or one type of research that is put on a pedestal over the others. This really is broadly conceived, which is one of the more fantastic things about the fellowship and the opportunity you have here to not only be part of a cohort, but also the different learning opportunities that you get. So please do apply if you're working within the field.
Even though I just got this one, even though I said it's, again, positionality statement differ from personal statement. Personal statement allows you to actually go through your prior history and in terms of like what led you to this work. It could be prior work experience, professional experience, could be prior research experience in your undergraduate institution. It's really like what led you to be interested. Not all that different than a personal statement you wrote when you applied to get into your PhD program. Presumably, why you're interested in this work, what's the what's important at stake here. It's an opportunity for those 3 paper writers here's another space where you might find some words to be able to talk about your broader interest in economics of education, for example, since typically those come from economics and why they are important and relevant to you professionally. I will say something I forgot to say earlier, which is really important for our students who are in disciplines that are adjacent to education or that are affiliated, but not necessarily directly. And that is, we really do care that you're interested in education topics for the long haul, not just for your dissertation work. We obviously don't follow up and test and make sure that that's what you're working on 10 years from now, but we hope that we're not just kind of just funding a dissertation project, that we're really investing in, especially in the network and in the mentoring that you're going to get in scholars across different disciplines that will continue to engage in education research. And so again, that personal statement allows you to sort of why this project, what is your personal trajectory that led you to this work and to your future career. It doesn't have to be all about the project. It could be about to your broader interest as an education researcher. The length questions, I would just consult the guidelines. There's definitely, there are limits on that. So I don't want to give you the wrong answer.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, and I think we can use this as a closing. Very much like review the application and start it now. So you don't need to have everything put together, but in order to like begin the application. Well, the application does have different guidelines in there. I believe many of them say like you only have 250 words to be able to respond here, or 100 words to respond here. So we do make it very specific for you to know, and begin reviewing it soon. And also, again, very much recommend start working with your reference writers sooner than later, because that October 5th deadline is going to be here before you know it. So with that, I think we will close it. If we did not answer your question, or if this is spur questions, please do write to us at info@naeducation.org. Very much appreciate having this opportunity to be able to connect with you all, share more about the NAEd Spencer Dissertation Fellowship. A big thank you, Dr. Kurlander, for being here, and Taylor for helping out with this webinar. And with that, we'll close it. We are recording it, so if you would like to rewatch, it will be on our website and also on YouTube within the week or two. So with that, thank you all so much.